First, we're going to each spend a few minutes kind of setting the stage, talking about some of our work on green and social finance and impact investing, and I will also add monetary policy. Then we're going to get into some methodological considerations, both connecting with a lot of the discussions we've been having over the past couple of days about following things, following money, following flows. And then finally, to get to some questions about the politics of all of this, which I think is sort of a nice movement after a lot of the discussions that have been had in the past couple days, to think about possibilities for alternative politics or trying to ask political questions in the sort of formulations of how we're theorizing financialization. So I guess I will begin. So I'm going to talk about two projects that I work on, and again try to be in conversation with some of the presentations that have happened over the past couple days. So I will begin by saying I have not actually done a lot of work on green transitions specifically, but I have done a lot of work on impact investing and social finance. And I want to try to first think about how we can highlight the social processes inherent in green transitions. And I want to sort of pull a theoretical point from this to make a suggestion about how we might consider finance of green transitions, especially in terms of the discussion yesterday about the environmental facets of the planetary financialization proposal. And this is that the green or the social kind of object or goals of finance, I think, need to continue to be theorized in their own right. So while I think it's important that we track and theorize the way that financialization works, I think we also need to pay attention to sort of why it's happening, like what facilitates it. And for me, this also means kind of maintaining our connection to a robust theory of capitalism. So in some of my work on social impact investing, I have considered sort of what produces the terrain of impact investing that can generate these kind of, feel good or moral or ethical profits. And in some of my more recent work, I was analyzing a lot of corporate moves in the US to brand certain investments as contributing to increasing racial justice in US society after the summer of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd. And I think this kind of tracks, the very quick cultural cycles around what's the consensus of what we're doing with our money, because I wrote this paper about the corporate sort of consolidation around racial justice as a good goal in 2020, and it's already now kind of gone back the other way, with a lot of companies kind of like trying to leave the sort of DEI space as we see a backlash in the US. But when I dug into these investments that were being made after 2020, it turned out that largely what was being done in sort of the name of racial justice was financing mortgages and small business loans for people of color. And if you looked at the breakdown of different corporate sectors that were investing in what they were calling racial justice, it turned out that the financial industry was completely dominant in the contributions compared to other corporate sectors. So if we zoom out, we can say, like, okay, in the name of racial justice, what you're doing is you're creating additional debts for people of color. And I won't say that increased access to mortgage capital or small business loans is inherently a bad thing, because this is the way that asset accumulation works in contemporary capitalism, but I do think that it needs to be theorized as an extension of racialized debt relations in the US. And so to understand this, in the paper I use theories of racial capitalism to think about, well, what created the uneven distribution of wealth and marginalization of Black people and people of color to begin with. So like what creates the conditions in which JP Morgan Chase can step up and say, well, we are investing to increase racial justice, and in which finance can be portrayed as a solution to racial inequality. And also, I think I wanted to make the point that this process, in sort of relation to this process, the federal government kind of completely ceded the response to George Floyd to the private sector, saying like, yes, look at all these nice donations and investments that are being made to increase racial justice in the economy. Like if you look on the side of the government, there were a lot of kind of moves to try to defund police in different municipalities, but most of them didn't come to fruition. So one question here I'm sort of asking is like, well, was reallocation of resources actually done? And the answer is more like, no, things were rebranded. And things like mortgages and loans that maybe would have been made anyway were now called racial justice investing. So if we want to try to apply this point to the green transition, I was thinking, okay, we need to finance the green transition because capitalism has created environmental degradation and it's put us on this path towards an unlivable future. But the unevenness of these effects and the specifics of what transitions are needed in different places, both spatially and temporally, is often what makes these green transition projects profitable. So I think we can't take for granted these relationships of oppression and inequality and marginalization and dispossession that make this sort of investing seem necessary. Like, I think we need to theorize this, or we risk kind of entrenching or taking for granted these relationships and missing their importance in the conclusions that we're drawing about green finance. Okay, second point. In this point, I want to talk about monetary policy. And so I'm working on a project right now with Dan Cohen and Martine August on the influence of monetary policy on spatial inequality. And I'm bringing this up because there are a lot of moves, especially with the European Central Bank, but I was also just reading about the Brazilian Central Bank, which has its own sustainability agenda starting in 2020 about this relationship. So in our paper, we're kind of looking at the crisis moment, the COVID crisis moment of 2020, to look at what did the Bank of Canada do in sort of reaction to try to quote unquote save the economy, which is what a lot of central banks were doing around the world. And we're looking at specifically how it added, basically, it bought corporate debt and did other things to try to increase liquidity in the economy. I think we've had some discussions, especially today, about the importance of liquidity to sort of corporate actions. So we're following the purchase of corporate bonds from the Bank of Canada, and we can identify three industries that dominate, and that was the automobile industry, the oil industry, and the real estate industry. And so in this paper, we're kind of looking at sort of what is done in the name of saving the economy, because there's all this discourse about, we have to salvage the economy for the good of all Canadians by supporting the flow of credit and the liquidity to sort of make sure that corporate debt markets can properly function. And we started sort of tracking what different companies did in these different sectors with all this liquidity that they finally, they had sort of all of a sudden. And the sort of larger point I want to make about this is that tracking these flows of money from public to private balance sheets helps us think about the public origins of what private companies can do. And we can, in our case, we're using this crisis moment in which this relationship is particularly visible. But again, trying to think about, well, how can we apply this to financing the green transition? I kind of have three takeaways, which I'll kind of continue to talk about throughout my comments. The first one being questioning how the best interest of everybody is defined and also conflated with the financial sector. Paying attention to how this abstracts and depoliticizes the ways that financial profits are actually made. So often it seems like finance seems to create profits on its own. But what we want to talk about in our paper is how this is supported and also subsidized by public policy and public money. So we basically have made an argument that we think central bank actions should be considered part of public finance, sort of kind of questioning this, neutrality, sort of setting apart of monetary policy. And then three, to bring attention to the ways that monetary policy actually facilitates financialization. Because basically what we find in our case study of the Canadian auto industry was that in this case, the Bank of Canada was kind of saving financialization by doing things like supporting the secondary market in auto loans, which is kind of interesting because auto loans or auto finance was one of the first places that financialization was identified when Grena Krippner started writing about it. And I think, we've had this discussion, especially on Wednesday, about this public-private financial relationship and how this may kind of produce precarity, and I want to kind of submit that monetary policy is really key to this. So, who's next?
Thank you so much, Emily. So Okay, so my reflections are perhaps a little less articulate and more scattered than what Emily just shared. I'll be drawing on emerging work that I've been doing with Danielle and also another collaborator, Paulo Pompeu, where we are looking into how impact investing markets are being constructed in Brazil and the role of particular kinds of intermediaries in constructing these markets. And I'll also talk a little bit about, what the green transition is looking like from a policy perspective in Brazil at the moment, and share what we've been learning in the Brazilian context. So first I wanted to say a little bit about my motivation for, starting to study sustainable finance kind of broadly defined. There is a lot of slippage on the concepts. Some actors, mobilize them in different kinds of ways, like sustainable finance, green finance, blue finance, impact investing, and so on. But at the core of it is like what Emily highlighted, that the idea that you can create financial returns or profit while also generating some sort of positive social or environmental impact. So for me, it was really interesting as I was doing work on financial investment in the water sector in Brazil. What I started to also see was that it was this very same financial investors, like specifically private equity investors, that were reframing water and sanitation as a sustainable green or blue type of investment to allow for further financial engagement via both equity and debt instruments. And they were this private water companies under financialized ownership were the first to introduce green debentures in some of these infrastructure sectors, and specifically in the water and sanitation sector. One of the companies also created a venture philanthropy fund for impact investing in rural sanitation, even though they don't operate in rural areas. But you could see how water and sanitation infrastructure and investment was becoming kind of part of this broader discourse on sustainable finance through the work of these investors. So that's kind of the background for me in terms of trying to understand how these spaces are becoming interconnected and what that is doing on the ground. So this has been happening in water in the last 5 to 7 years, but it was happening also without a larger kind of policy framework at the national level to guide whatever might be the green transition or how we define it. But this was until last year. So briefly on what has been happening in Brazil. Last year at the COP28, the Brazilian government launched the Ecological Transition Plan, which is a package of policy initiatives that are centered around 3 areas: environmental sustainability, employment and productivity, and social justice. And there are several pillars under these 3 areas, but among which I think are relevant for us, the fact that they are trying to support the energy transition in particular, develop green infrastructure, and promote sustainable finance as part of that process. I've already talked a little bit about the question of terminology. The government has been using sustainable finance to kind of cover all these types of different investment instruments. In the industry, as we've seen in the impact investing research that we're doing, some actors try to draw a kind of clear line separating impact investing, for example, as positive impact from ESG as negative impact, while other actors are kind of moving fluidly between these concepts and kind of acting opportunistically in terms of how they mobilize this frame. So I think that's kind of something interesting to pay attention to, how that becomes a space for agency as well, this kind of conceptual blurriness. What are some of the concrete policy initiatives that are being proposed in the last year? This is all kind of under development. One is a taxonomy to define a common vocabulary around sustainable investment and define what counts as sustainable. And if you go through the working report for this taxonomy, there are particular ways in which the urban or nature are being kind of codified into the creation of this taxonomy. And I think that's also another thing that would be really interesting to look into and think about. This is not kind of particular to Brazil. I think some of you might know that Brazil here is following in the footsteps of other countries and regions, like the European Union, China, even, where they've been launching very similar kinds of taxonomies. A second program is what they're calling Eco Invest. This is a set of initiatives that they're meant to deal with barriers to foreign investment, like exchange rate volatility, and they include, for example, currency hedging instruments, blended finance, and supporting project structuring as well. And finally, like another instrument is infrastructure debentures, which are fixed income debt instruments that are issued by corporations to finance projects. And some of the water companies that I mentioned have been kind of instrumental in helping to develop some of those debentures in the last few years. So from a kind of macro perspective, Daniela Gabor and others have been situating the sorts of policy initiatives as a form of development as de-risking, right, as a kind of new paradigm, like a new Wall Street consensus, to try to bring private finance capital by reducing risks and creating investable assets from investors' point of view. And this obviously raises the question about the extent to which these initiatives can really deliver on the ecological transition and push us towards more sustainable development, which relates to a question that was raised here on our very first day around whether green transition or around whether green finance can deal with the sort of unsustainability of capitalism. And I think I want to kind of address this point, like this tension, like can this be a pathway, like an alternative way to approach, the issues, that capital accumulation has brought forth historically in terms of social reproduction, ecological issues, etc. So this is part of the question that's driving our project on like the work of intermediary organizations in constructing impact investing markets. In this project, we have been exploring specifically what the biographies of these intermediary organizations reveal about the social-political construction of these markets. Because these intermediaries, and here we're talking about various kinds of intermediation, but essentially they perform crucial market-making roles, such as connecting investors to impact businesses or impact-related projects, creating various kinds of financial instruments, fostering networks, circulating knowledge, mobilizing the state. But their kinds of, their lives, their trajectories, their activities have received comparatively less attention, I would say, than the development of particular impact investing instruments, for example. So we've done a mapping of intermediary organizations in this market. We've been doing semi-structured interviews with a range of different actors, document analysis, like the usual kind of methods for qualitative research. And what our analysis has shown so far is that while these organizations emerge from various transformative imaginaries, like some of them quite radical in wanting to change capitalism and confront its contradictions, their trajectories are really marked by power asymmetries and by struggles to survive. So a lot of the logic that has been driving the impact investing market in Brazil is a logic of survival, where especially organizations that come outside of the financial industry or from non-financial backgrounds really struggle to be able to monetize this market-making role that they perform, because the role is not perceived as financially valuable, even though it's considered socially valuable from the point of view of market making. A lot of the organizations talked about the need, for a lot of convincing when it comes to attracting financial investors. Like they're not really on the same page on like delivering impact while at the same time generating a certain expected level of financial return. And interestingly, when we look at their kind of trajectories over time, their biographies, we also notice that a lot of these organizations, rather than try to change the way capitalism works, it started providing ESG services to big corporations, right? So there isn't really a transformative aspect because survival requires them to find ways to become financially sustainable. So that's where we are at right now. We're still trying to think this through, but I wanted to share some kind of preliminary thoughts. And I think this helps kind of shed light on some emerging work that we're seeing in, even with relation to impact invest instruments like social impact bonds that point to the limits and the contradictions of these transformative capitalist projects that sometimes are radical, but then end up working to maintain the system.
So moving from your right to the left, we sort of go from the macro scale down to my work, which is much more focused on the urban scale and on sort of the challenges of finance at the scale of the local state. I think we also sort of move, and it's a bit of a ruse, right? If Isadora said, my remarks are scattered, it's a bit of a ruse, bit of a trap to be on this panel with these two. But we also see an increase in scatteredness as we move from right to left. Like Emily, my interest in sort of the green financial questions of green finance and financing green transitions emerged out of a focus on social finance. So initially, Rachel and our co-author Marc Dussard, we were focusing on sort of the dynamics of finance within the public goods space and infrastructure in particular. And after 2008, sort of followed that into, as it sort of fell forward in cities like Chicago, into questions such as crowdfunding, right? Sort of how does capital formation work around social investments, right? Some of them very localized in the sense of like investments in public parks or other sorts of community-driven demands. Now we're sort of following that into a research project on what is being termed non-extractive finance, actors who are sort of explicitly looking for opportunities to structure the loan transaction in ways that support and help flourish worker co-ops, particularly those owned by entrepreneurs of color. So those social questions, I think, have sort of shaped my interest in sort of the green questions, and and each of those areas, whether it's crowdfunding, whether it's sort of the new forms of infrastructure investment, or whether it's this interest in non-extractive finance, they're quite diverse in their approaches and their contexts and their forms and in their ultimate goals. It's easy to say that they represent very sort of distinct kind of questions, but I think they share an orientation to using financial liquidity and trying to manufacture in some ways financial liquidity as a means of solving pressing social and political problems. So I sort of follow the UK scholar Paul Duguay, who refers to these as political devices of liquidity, right? Essentially sort of looking to financial liquidity as political instruments to try and do things that the state otherwise can't do. And that, I think, at the local scale, that involves a vocabulary that's much more focused on, say, assetization, right? Lurking in the background are the larger questions around, say, financial circuits, as Isadora maybe has put on the table for us, or the ultimate questions of monetary policy and sort of the dynamics of capitalist money, as Emily broached. But in the context where I'm studying in particular, the public building retrofits and sort of investments in climate transition by local states, focusing on their own facilities. The question of how do you manufacture a financial asset out of nothing, essentially, is a really pressing one, and it requires, I think, a very sort of up-close vocabulary to how, in fact, finance works at the scale of the object or at the scale of very specific relationships that are embedded in green transition. So retrofits, I think I introduced this notion on Wednesday in some of the opening comments. But the idea in the American context, the idea of forming a financial market or some sort of financial connection around the energy savings generated by the installation of green building technologies, right? On paper, it's relatively intuitive, right? If you invest in green building technologies, you lower the energy footprint, and that potentially opens up a kind of financial increment, the energy savings increment that then can be capitalized, right? Can be both analyzed as an object of investment by financial analysts, but also can be captured, secured, and transferred like any other negotiable financial instrument. On paper, the process sounds very intuitive, but following that process as it sort of works its way from conception into application involves a lot of gymnastics, right? A lot of permutations, a lot of sort of a lot of maneuvering in order to make it work. So the instruments themselves are at the center of this are relatively novel. They're relatively new. The negawatt model, if any of you have sort of followed the concept of the negawatt, the notion that the energy savings itself can be sort of fixed and made available as an object of, as a revenue stream that can secure financial investments. The notion, I think, from a green transition point of view, scales upwards, right? It's both something that works at a very specific scale, at specific buildings or specific configurations of buildings, but also generates a kind of imagination of a market, right? That if we do this at a large enough scale, the green transition won't involve a deduction from social revenues, right? It won't involve essentially diverting critical social resources away from productive investments, but instead will be the basis for a self-reinforcing market mechanism, right? So but this poses problems in terms of how energy savings match against the scale or volatility of other revenue flows, and also the degree to which the negawatts, right, the energy increment, the degree to which it mimics or diverges from other capital market instruments. So the challenges here are that green transition often involves long time frames, and here I'm thinking about Sarah Knuth's work on sort of the city as a resource frontier, right? In many ways, the conditions of possibility, as Emily has pointed out, the conditions of possibility for green transition are that many public facilities and many of our buildings were built at a time of cheap energy, so they leak energy, and the process of fixing that is one that involves investments that have quite long amortization periods. The negawatts, the energy increments themselves, the savings that are generated from those investments don't have straightforward payback profiles, right? They may go up in the wintertime, they may go down in the summertime. So the returns themselves are relatively volatile, and that's a problem in the sense of if you've got a fixed investment, it needs to be configured against this potentially unstable and unruly form of revenue. And the question of security is really pressing, right? So how, in fact, can a creditor or an investor, how can they transform their investment back into capital if it doesn't work out as anticipated, right? So the notions of collateral and the devices around security are really critical ones, and they're not ones, right? I know that assetization at the local scale has often focused on pre-existing asset frameworks, right? So public sector authorities look at land and they sort of identify their own land holdings or their own building holdings, and they sell those off, right? And those are relatively simple forms of assetization because the frameworks for property are among the most advanced and most well-developed available. For energy increments, these need to be constructed out of whole cloth, and I think that's one of the challenges of the green transition financing, is that many of the forms of returns, maybe the sort of the anchors that we're looking for, or that finance is looking for, don't exist, and they kind of need to be manufactured. So that process of fixing is one that, when you look at it up close and personal, it's relatively fascinating. It's obviously a socio-technical process of stabilizing those energy flows, of understanding their volatility, of understanding their characteristics, right? So there's a kind of engineering dimension to understanding the materiality of the object itself and the ways in which it makes available revenue and those characteristics. So there's a kind of an analytic dimension to stabilizing the green increment. There's the process of transforming that into property rights, right? Of sort of essentially in the context of the local state, carving out the energy increment and making it into a private object as opposed to something that belongs to the public sector, and that's its own set of questions around access to property and also the nature of liability, right? How is it that those objects can be handed off to the private sector? There's the financial process of qualification, right? So those who have studied out sort of assetization and asset classes, the notion of holding up objects against other kinds of objects to make them commensurate and understand their distinctions, sort of polishing off the rough edges of a revenue stream to make it look like something else, and then the manufacturing of security devices, sort of producing collateral out of whole cloth, so that in situations where financial speculative bets don't pay off, that there is an opportunity to try and transform those bets back into capital. We can talk more about the implications. I think I broached some of these on on Wednesday the notion, for instance, that the search for green rent essentially means has some very specific implications for sort of the characteristics of green transition, the mechanics of capture and the degree to which states and other actors get involved and enrolled in the process of trying to encircle and capture those rents. So we can come back to those. But I will say generally my approach I sort of borrow from my colleague Rachel Weber, who in her initial work she worked on the peace dividend at the end of the Cold War, and she describes her hot take as what happened to the peace dividend. Financial capital captured it, and I've sort of borrowed that and now use it in the context of the green dividend, right? To the extent that we're investing or that states are being called upon to invest in these and support these forms of green transition, they're opening up these savings, these expenditures that we weren't that we were previously making that are now we wouldn't need because we're spending less on energy or on water. That green dividend essentially is being handed over to capital. Okay, so that sort of sets the stage. Thank you. What we wanted to do is, I think, sort of following the protocol of the earlier emerging finance session, is to sort of open it up a little bit. And I think the question that we're interested, so an opportunity to both hear from you all about sort of work and perspectives that you have on the challenges and the sort of parameters, the forms of conceptualization that are necessary to understand the imbrication of finance and climate change. But specifically, I think the methodological questions are really pressing ones. So the notion of what are we following, and I'll just set the stage before we hand things over. And I think, right, in many ways we have. We've inherited a kind of vocabulary of finance that sort of becomes the natural way in which we start to interpret these dimensions, right? So, who has the most correct reading of Harvey, and in what ways can we sort of apply the notions of a circuit or of switching to understand this? And I think that those are obviously quite useful and important conceptual tools as we start to understand, for instance, the challenges around monetary policy and central banking. But I also think that green transitions exist in imagination at this point, right? That we're not always necessarily looking at concrete markets. We're looking at imaginations of markets. So the idea of how do those imaginaries work, and is it just at the level of words and discourse, or are there other ways in which we can think about how an imaginary changes relationships or gets involved in changing the terms of debate? So should I just open? Yeah, okay. So maybe we can use that challenge, that provocation, right? What's involved in following the money in the context of green transition, and open up the floor for conversation.
So I'm very curious about highlighting the contradictions in these processes. And I would follow the money on the other way around. So who actually pays for this? And I would look into fiscal policies in parallel with monetary policies, and asking if in your cases you see that state de-risking and de-risking in social impact investment and green transition, does it go with a change in fiscal policies where labor is increasingly taxed while capital is less taxed in your cases? I'm really curious about that, and because this would really highlight the contradiction.
Should we collect a couple of questions and then...
Sorry, it's only the methodological issue, or it's broader?
If you want to...
Huh? Okay, yeah. I just was thinking to introduce the European perspective in this discussion, and this bring us also the need for a historical view on how the politics of green transition is embedded in historical EU context, and how EU policies, generally speaking, create investment opportunities for capital in all of its member states. So it's not something new, which started with the green transition and the new European programs on the European Green Deal, for example, which launched the renovation wave to call for investing into greening buildings, and by this creating opportunities to new investments, but also the Repower EU program, which in the context of Ukrainian war brought another political argument for why do we need green transition, because we need an energy independence from the Russian fossil fuels. So therefore this is somehow circulated very strongly among member states, and but it's all this war condition created a paradox in a way. So reference to the war justified the transition to alternative energy sources, but at the same time called to transfer public money towards militarization. So in a way, EU, I guess, it's losing its direction towards green transition and creating new obstacles for this. Actually, for the military industry is a very polluting industry. So yeah. And this is what I wanted to add to see larger political structures around this, the green transitions programs, and also these historical institutional practices by which the EU, for example, always created investment opportunities through its European Banking Union, Capital Markets Union. So maybe something specific for Europe, but maybe we need to add this. And also this obsession with the uniqueness of the European social model. Actually, that's also introduced into this European Green Deal, assuming that the EU is able to assure a just green transition, which is actually a political promise without no historical or current evidence of being able doing so. Yeah.
This table is very interesting because my research is the theme across my research, and then it's very interesting. But I think my question is to Isadora, maybe Emily too. I'm trying to understand that have you observed in some sectors that have more stood out and do a great interest into the investors, and try to understand why certain initiatives are more highlighted and have more possibility to consolidate and with through the impact investment. It's that. Just a comment. The comment that they say, I think the idea of the contradictions, it's something that it's important to understand too. It's really interesting.
John? Oh, well, yeah, sure. I can address a couple of the points, and then perhaps use that as a seg into our own thoughts on the methodological question. Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, you're asking from the perspective of impact investors in particular, what they're interested in? Yeah, okay. So I think I have two thoughts on this that come to mind. One is that we also need to consider that there are different investment profiles, like within the impact investing space. And like sometimes if we're using the grammar and the schemes that investors themselves use, they see these investments on a sort of gradient of how much return you're willing to sacrifice to generate impact, right? And you might find a little bit of everything within that gradient. But the big investor firms. Or some of the more high profile investing organizations that we've spoken to, they are interested in the impact businesses that can be scaled up. Yeah, and often that has to do with a startup type model or some connection to technology. So a lot of ed tech, health tech, etc. Is kind of what we've been seeing. On the question, I love what you said about kind of flipping the question and following who pays, because I do think that a lot of perhaps how we've looked into this or to state or infrastructures in the discussions that we've had so far is through this perspective of how investment flows, right? But there is a huge literature on the everyday debts that those processes generate, and I think that kind of gets to where you're talking about. And Nancy Fraser, I think in her recent, not as recent, she's very prolific, probably has another book after that, but Cannibal Capitalism talks about, how that at these various scales works as a disciplining mechanism, right, from the everyday all the way to national states, particularly in the global south, that are, constrained by that relations relative to global north counterparts and so forth. But I think, so I wanted to build on this kind of question to, think on the methodological question. I think there are two, inspired by the conversations that we've been having and a lot of, the talk around following the money journey or the constellation or the group or the firm, right? I think that's really helpful for helping us see the money flows, the actors, the relationships that are involved. And a lot of that work is a political work of, making finance visible, right? Moving beyond this kind of opaqueness that, we are also familiar with. But there is also something that really bothers me with the idea of following, and that's the kind of thought that I wanted to share. The anxiety that it generates for me, and I don't know if it's shared, but is that when we're talking about following, inevitably there is a sense that we're behind, right? And that finance in this case is charting the path. So my question is how can we get ahead of finance? And if there is a methodological way to do that, that is a thing I would be really interested in thinking about. And here I'm kind of inspired by the work of feminist activists and scholars like Luchi Cavaliero and Veronica Gago in Argentina, where they are, argue that a critical feminist perspective on that specifically is both about making it visible and collective, but also about finding ways to disobey it, to counter, as they put it, this the ways in which that organizes disciplining, right? So if we think about finance more broadly, should we be thinking about how can we disrupt flows, prevent financial valuation, bring forth other planning rationalities? So should we start making finance's path more difficult? Is that desirable even? So those are some of the questions that I have that I don't have answers to, but that I wanted to share with you.
Thank you. I really liked what you said about following. I think I have some comments that kind of go along with that, which I kind of started thinking about yesterday, which is the question of where are we beginning? And how much are we, like you said, centering finance and the sort of actors that we consider to be at the center of finance, and trying to track its flows, because it seems so opaque and so complex, and it's just so hard to keep up, and there's all these things to track. And I think it's important sort of methodologically not to seed its outcomes or impacts, or as some people have specified, material like impacts as fuzzier than our attempts to follow all the asset managers and the analysts and everything. And so I think it's important to remember like why we all care so much about this and like why we're so interested in finance is because of, you know, a lot of the sort of impacts it has on our world and how we're all so constrained by it. And we feel like we can't exist in this economy without it. So just not to allow other things that are quite important to why we're doing this work to become fuzzier than our articulation of which asset manager is doing which thing. And then I also kind of started to think about, well, are we looking more at the supply of finance? Are we taking the supply of finance for granted because we're so interested in, you know, what are these asset managers doing? And then I wanted to think about like where is the demand for finance coming from beyond this sort of abstract imperative that we need to transition. So maybe we can specify that more. So yeah, my observation from a lot of the talks is that we're kind of abstracting and blurry about social reproduction we use as a catch-all or like inequality, despite all being very interested in power relations. So maybe a call to continue to focus on those as well and not to reinforce the technical nature of finance. I have like a more specific method point. This is going to get way more jumbled, I think. But in my work with Dan and Martine on monetary policy, we have been looking at balance sheets and engaging with the work of critical accountants. And there has been some reference in this conference to sort of accounting as a technology and how we might sort of integrate that into our analyses. And this kind of gets to following in a way, and following movements from public to private via balance sheets. So this is not like one-to-one dollar movements, but following this, but while triangulating it with discourse. So looking at what these management commentaries in our case are about investors that are referencing the Bank of Canada's actions. And this, I think, helps me because I'm continuously like stymied by this question of like, well, how do we know, like, because they have more liquidity that they're making this investment versus that investment and having these, you know, material impacts. And it's at least helpful for me to be like, because they said they did, right? Because they told their investors this is, you know, a really great opportunity because of liquidity. I'm going to kind of zoom forward. I guess another thing I wanted to say, which maybe relates to more of the first point I was making, is a continued focus, I think, on trying to be relational, right? So when we're following, we're like so caught up in tracking that we might forget to be relational and maintain attention to the specificities of social and spatial relationships. So in our case, for example, it's not just enough to be like, all right, how do we see where the money flowed? We're also trying to come at it from the other side and be like, okay, all of a sudden these banks had a lot of liquidity. Like at that time, who was getting mortgages during this crisis? And in Canada, it turns out people who had really high incomes and really high credit scores and didn't need mortgage insurance and were getting mortgages on like second or third homes or investment properties. And so we can examine like the claims of the Bank of Canada, like, oh, we're saving the economy in relation to what companies are doing with liquidity and be like, well, were they hiring people that needed jobs? No, they were giving out second mortgages, kind of like perpetuating this housing crisis in Canada. And I guess I also wanted to sort of say, kind of related to this, that I think we need to really maintain this attention that you mentioned to debt. And in my case, I'm really interested in public debt, which is really important to a financialized economy, which everyone has, I think, said a lot this conference, and how that sort of provides different incentives to different sectors, kind of getting to what you were talking about, and look at sort of like, well, what is the public sector willing to take on in the name of green investment and in the name of transition finance? And a lot of this kind of stuff is hidden in these accounting processes that they just like maybe seem a little boring, so like, oh, whatever, the accountant's doing it, but are actually like very interesting and very political when you examine them.
On the question of the European Green Deal and EU policy, I think in some ways that elevates the notion that I think is really central that Emily just referred to, is that in many cases, following the money requires us to follow it into public finance, and that really the imaginations that we have that come from an inherited vocabulary of critical financial scholars or critical geographers really only gets us so far, because the instruments and the sort of modalities are very, very different. And in particular, I think sort of the EU, and in my case, the American context, requires us to understand sort of the connections between green finance and austerity. Right, and I think in the European context, and here I'm looking at Felix because he's done work with Francesca Artioli on sort of and as well as more recent work on green transition in France with Ludo and others. Sort of the configurations of accessing of capitalizing green transitions at the local scale through sort of mediated forms of access, not just to private finance but also to EU subsidies and ultimately into the European Central Bank. And I think that those sort of those kind of mediated arrangements are ones that are really critical to understand, right? Because they sort of involve a packaging together of subsidy with finance and a sort of configuration that, and in the U.S. context, we don't have that, right? We don't, essentially the relationship of the locality to the central bank is one that is highly at arm's length, except that it is except through the municipal bond markets. Municipal bond markets work in very different ways, and sort of the nature of austerity and the ways in which austerity logics work don't offer subsidy and don't offer those possibilities for a kind of embracing of an investment and a packaging of investment with subsidy and private finance. They involve a kind of direct relationship with municipal bond investors. And those don't really necessarily even function as markets, right? The idea that this is actually a market is a bit of a misnomer, right? It's not a sort of like abstract, perfectly competitive market. In many cases, these are bespoke arrangements, single investors working through the apparatuses and the forms and instruments of the U.S. Municipal bond market, able to use a kind of tax incentive to be able to issue credit that is priced below what private market would normally would offer, but bringing with it a whole set of issues that really are not about kind of like private returns, but about how the local state has to configure itself in order to make sure that the forms of returns are consistent and legible to municipal bond. And in the context of retrofits, that involves a lot of gymnastics, as I said. And I think it gets back to this question. I'll link this to the question of who pays, because ultimately I think the distributional questions are really critical ones, but I would go beyond just the question of who pays, right? The notion of there's a distributional consequences, or that the forms of payment involve other parties, extends beyond just the revenue question. It extends into the questions of security, for instance. Who's liable if the investment in green building technologies doesn't pan out? And it turns out those social structures of liability are far more complex, and they involve a lot more than just consumers and producers. So in the just as a simple example, the green retrofits in Chicago, the contract required that the city, in order to sort of generate the energy increment at a level that was sufficient and stable enough to pay back the loan that the city got from Bank of America to invest, to install all these energy conservation measures, the contract required that the city keep all of its facilities in the portfolio, keep them open and occupied at the same level as before the contract, right? So essentially locked in occupancy and use as a condition for the kind of stable flow of energy. Now, that may not seem like very much, right? It just means that for a certain set of libraries or fire stations or other public facilities, that those stay open to the same degree. But to the extent that the city of Chicago is facing ongoing austerity pressures, right? It essentially takes a portfolio of public facilities and it holds them separate, meaning that future budget cuts, future budget pressures are going to be felt much more intensively on the rest of the portfolio, right? So that idea of a kind of distributional logic isn't just, you know, that the payment comes through taxation or through some sort of kind of jerry-rigged form of revenue that is recycled through the city's budget, but that there are other kinds of distributional questions that ultimately are there to kind of manufacture the kinds of security that financiers want. Should we turn to another round of questions? We have 15 minutes left. Okay. Should we turn to the question of politics? All right. I don't. I mean, so we've thrown the concept of post-political out here. We've, I think, tried to think of some frameworks to. I don't know. Do you guys? Does somebody want to start? I'm drawing a blank.
Sure. I'm probably not going to comment on the post-political because it's a concept that still confounds me. And as a political scientist, I find it really hard not to see politics in everything. So, so I don't know. So my reflections on this question of like, what about the politics? I think there are perhaps 3 points that I thought would be like worth raising or sharing. Like specifically when we're thinking about green financing, right, and the emergence of these different kinds of instruments that claim some form of sustainability or social or environmental impact. I think the historical point that has kind of been a theme today is like really important, right? Green finance is not new, and it's also inserting itself within existing markets that have particular political institutional histories, often already financialized markets, right, in other ways. And I think in order to explore the politics, we need to consider, how these markets develop historically, and how, these instruments become mobilized also for particular kinds of power projects or distributional projects and so forth. So as I mentioned earlier, for water and sanitation, the development of green and blue bonds, like, or in this case specifically, debentures is the term that we would use in Portuguese or in Brazil, has been led by these private financialized water companies and by private equity firms that are seeking to leverage that to finance these infrastructure projects in models that we are kind of familiar with in terms of how private equity works across different kinds of industries. So this kind of leads into my second point, which is kind of at the core of what my PhD work was on, like, understanding the political dynamics that underpin private investment, or kind of what I think of as the political work that is necessary to turn, infrastructures like water and sanitation into profitable assets. I think often there is an assumption that, the institutions are already in place, like that the contracts are going to work and be enforced over time. But particularly when we're thinking about contexts like Brazil or across Latin America more broadly, that cannot really be taken for granted, right? And what we see is consistent contract renegotiations over time, the role of political relations and how it matters for how these projects, concessions, public-private partnerships develop. So, what does it take politically to earn these returns is a question that I think is really worth pursuing. And that goes, I would say, beyond just looking at state institutions or the state as a kind of monolithic actor, because when we're talking about politics here, I'm talking not just about, state bureaucrats, which also have often various kinds of planning rationalities that they bring to the table. But I'm also thinking about political cycles and the kinds, like, a lot of, in my research on water and sanitation, it was really interesting to hear that a lot of the reasons projects died was because of political cycles, because the next mayor was not going to take up that project, right? And I've heard this in the context of impact investing projects as well. So that kind of, the way that politics matters in kind of various kinds of ways in terms of the coalitions that we've heard about that kind of do this work of coordination, even like in relation to party politics or ideology. I think these are all really interesting dimensions to pull out. And I guess my third point in relation to this is that, like, now, thinking specifically about policy advice, like mainstream policy advice in development, that we see like from IFC, World Bank, and some of these other institutions that are behind this, bringing private finance into sustainable development goals. There is often an expectation there that it's the job of governments or state actors to put in place the institutional frameworks that are going to make investments attractive for financial investors or private actors more broadly. And I think sometimes this kind of assumption from the policy sphere seeps into how we think about politics in research work as well, that we don't really investigate how the institutions that are enabling come into being in the first place. I think a lot of the work that was presented here already kind of brought a lot of insights into kind of destabilizing this idea that enabling institutions exist and then investors just come. But I think more can be done to think about how different kinds of financial investors are political actors in themselves and how they work to create the institutional environments that are conducive to their reproduction over time. Like in my work, like I try to trace that in the context of a water and sanitation reform that passed in Brazil in 2020, which has led to a huge amount of new private investment into the sector, and dozens of new concessions across the territory, including in the state of Rio de Janeiro, that has been partitioned across in 4 zones, each of them being now dominated by a different kind of private water company. And that comes from this institutional reform, but it wasn't like we saw in the media discourse, a case of, the government passed this regulatory change and now we're seeing private investment flowing in. It was the financialized companies that were already in the sector and needed to create room for market growth that mobilized politically in a quite strong way to make sure that this reform would pass. So I just feel like paying attention to this longer term political processes and how these institutional environments come into being is another way to take politics into consideration.
Okay, so I kind of talked about politics in all of my points, because I think there's always this how are we integrating politics into our analysis, and then also what are the politics of our work, which I think are both important questions when we're dealing with these topics. And in terms of the first question, sort of integrating politics into our analysis, that I'll go back to my earlier point of theory is important, not just of financialization, but also of a lot of the other processes that are tied up in this. In a lot of work, a lot of North American work on financialization, people are increasingly looking to theories of racial capitalism and colonialism, for example, to understand financialization. And I think the kinds of theories we need is going to vary by place and context and history, but just to submit that we maintain those links as well and kind of refuse to sort of inherit this understanding of finance as technical. And then in terms of asking political questions with our research, a question that I think, maybe it would apply from the work we've been doing on saving the Canadian economy, that we could ask about green finances, what are we doing in the name of saving the environment? And what's interesting to me, and I'm not a scholar in the resilience literature, but I've interacted a little bit with engineers who are interested in energy retrofits and transition finance, and they're so obsessed with resilience. And their idea of resilience is the system can bounce back to what it was before. And so this question of, when we're trying to finance stuff to change the infrastructures, but we're still trying to pay attention to the way it was before as the goal, I think raises a lot of interesting questions for research and the questions that we're asking, I guess. What are we replicating? And I think in the case of monetary policy, which we've kind of started to talk about already, is this understanding that exists both in sort of the way that monetary policy is carried out, that it's neutral. And I think this is starting to become questioned as we're all like suffering with inflation and interest rate problems. But among the circles of those who sort of administer monetary policy, this idea of neutrality is like very, very like important. And so in the kind of work we're doing, we're trying to sort of ask questions about this, and show that like it's not actually neutral. So we can show like what interests are served by injections of liquidity that are done in the name of keeping the economy going. Like what industries are worth saving, and that I think is really interesting. And be like, oh, you saved like the fossil fuel industry that now builds pipeline through more indigenous land and pollutes the country. So that's an interesting contradiction. But I also think like if central banks focus so much on this idea of status quo and neutrality and just returning the economy to what it was before, and they spend a lot of time thinking about this, like they could probably also work around other goals, and not to have too much of a starry-eyed vision of the EU central bank around its green goals. But there are lots of different political calls for sort of how central banks and monetary policy could be organized. So in 2020, for example, in the States, there was this movement around like, okay, what if we made racial justice a goal of monetary policy, which obviously didn't get much traction, but there's sort of this growing attention to like, it could have other goals. The economy is not just what corporations do. And so I think that is an interesting idea for research if we're trying to think about the sort of possibility for alternative politics to investigate the mechanisms that are put in place to reproduce the status quo, to make the economy quote unquote resilient, and maybe ask questions about how things might organize or be organized differently.
No way, I'm not following that. It's a trap. Should we open it for questions or comments? I just said I'm not following that. That's a trap. I got nothing to say after that. No? Yeah, everybody's getting a little hungry. Okay. Well, we're a little ahead of time, but Ludo, thank you. Ludo, falling on this sword for us.
So I know how it feels when you're over there and no one is actually asking a question or commenting. Now more seriously, about the politics of research, maybe of green financialization, the concern that I have at the moment is how we might collectively, as critical researchers, fall into the trap of green financialization, in the way that we have a lot of works now that that try and critically study how green finance or blue finance or maybe black finance or red, if we think about social impact of finance, how finance is trying to create new assets and niches of investments, and where it's our job also as critical researchers to try and unpack what's there. But by doing this, and I think you suggested that in your presentations, we do not look at how more systematically or structurally finance is actually transforming our environment, our social relationships, and then the politics of capitalism, if I may. So that's really my comment. I don't know where we should go, but I have the feeling that we could easily suffer from a form of fetishism with the object we're studying. It's easy, so they pretend they are doing something new with these green labels, blue labels, etc. So it gives us a way to an advantage on the market for new ideas in the papers we are trying to get published in, because we follow something that is seemingly new. And I'm not sure this is the way where we should actually go. Felix, you suggested yesterday or the day before, I don't remember. Days are a bit long now. That we would need, for instance, when talking about the environment, to actually look at the environmental impact, and that means radical transdisciplinarity, because there are things we just don't know how to do in terms of research. And actually I would try to, that's where I think we should be going more than to actually follow the new financial device. That's very long for a basic comment actually, sorry.
It's from a critique of green finance to the environmental critique of finance. Is that it?
Yes, well, I think we are speaking of quite a different set of topics. I mean, if we speak about green finance, of course we are in the sector of finance, and we look at these things as if we would be financier, okay? But there is also another topic which is, I think Emily spoke about that. It's finding the means to realize the transition, which is a totally different topic, I mean. But of course we need money in order to do that. But this money doesn't compulsorily come from financial markets. I mean, this is typical of the neoliberal understanding of building collective action, okay? You have to get indebted to financial markets in order to do something. But there are other possibilities to do that. And I think we have to come back to the Tim Jackson's work, and where he says, okay, there are some investments that we can do and that will bring back private incomes. For example, Phil, you spoke about that. When you are saving in energies, normally there is a flow in the future, which is a private return. Then we can, of course, have financial market that consider this, okay? And there are all other kinds of investments that bring collective returns back. I mean, and there are also other investments that do not bring any income back, okay? So typically, yes, I said the other day, to reconstitute the humus layer. It's very difficult. So where can we find the means to finance things that cost, okay? And I think the central bank is absolutely unavoidable, the question of the monetary policy. And it's interesting to say, okay, what would happen if we would put in the goals, as you were suggesting, for example, to have some kinds of investments in nature, let's say, to say it. And I think it's crucial, and we don't have to forget that our monetary institutions today have been built through the neoliberal, during the neoliberal era. I mean, it's Reagan, Thatcher that imposed that focus on inflation, the so-called neutrality, which is not a neutrality as you've really said. It's absolutely true. It's in favor of the financial system and the banking system, point, and that's it. But we can perfectly say that we put other goals to this monetary policy. And I think it's perhaps the ultimate transition out of neoliberalism would be the transformation of central bank institutions, for sure.
I would add to this, so maybe thinking about going beyond capitalism and not only neoliberalism would be the more radical way to think about alternatives. So it's there is all these discussions that we already had on definancialization, which in my mind means finding non-profit financial instruments and institutions to finance economy and to disconnect the financing from supporting profit-making interests. So putting financing into the interests of social needs and social value creation, which means actually also democratization of financial decisions. So a new political consensus around what is that we really need to to support people, to support the labor force, to support nature, or whatever field that we are working on. So for us in Eastern Europe, an inevitable way of thinking about the alternative is about socialism, but as you said, not returning to the past, so really existing socialism, but to, you know, revisit those, say, socialist legacies, how it was possible to find money for public goods, public housing, public services. And why is that not possible anymore? How the whole state restructures, economy restructures, and actually capitalism came that destroyed actually those practices. So taking those legacies, thinking about them, how they can be reshaped for a today alternative to capitalism. Okay.
Are there more questions? I think everyone wants to eat. Oh, there's one more question, but that was a great way to end also. Yeah.
Hi. Okay. I still in my polemical way, but I understand all these things. But Isadora told us about the law in 2020, the sanitation law here in Brazil, and we talk about the left wing try to stop this movement and but don't propose nothing in the place. So it's wrong, it's financialized, it's a problem. But what we should do? I know that this idea of superation, neoliberalism, capitalism, it's a very highly important topic in academia. But in daily life, we need to face a very clear political process, the discussion of a law, and we need to propose something. But we are still paralyzed. We can't propose nothing. We are just saying that's problematic, and we all know that's problematic. But in political terms, in action, that doesn't result nothing. The law was approved, these companies are working, and that's the point. I know that in this perspective, we don't need to propose in academy. So we can discuss this. Some scholars think that we don't need to propose. We as an analytical task. But I think there's a problem. So the Brazilian case for me is so clear. In US and Europe could be a little bit different, but our reality here impose some needs and very urgent needs. So how can we deal with it? So that's my point. I understand theoretically and this utopia. I call utopia not in a bad way, okay? But for me, there is. So I don't know how many of you knows Rio or other cities, but in a very quick walking around Rio de Janeiro, you can easily note our problems. So there is problems in the real world that we need to propose something in political way. So that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's just a quick question. A link with this is that I think most of the presentation we're seeing over these few days are the ways in which the new frontiers have been reached, so to say. So new opportunities, windows of opportunities have been unlocked. And I think when I thought about Antoine's presentation, for example, having historical longue durée accounts show that you've got some asset classes that are constructed and then deconstructed in a way. And I think maybe one of the productive ways of thinking, I mean, it's probably been done already in some case studies and stuff, but to see how some asset classes have been locked anew, like unlocked and then newly locked, so to say. So and what kind of parameters have been modified so that it's not a profitable asset class anymore. And I think when you talked to Isadora about water infrastructure, for example, I thought about this kind of movements of remunicipalization. But yeah, I think showing, and I think that's also when you talked about the how our institutional frameworks constructed. Yes, I guess like financial rationalities and financialized rationalities play a role, but then how can we highlight the other rationalities that play a role in constructing those institutional frameworks? And I think Antoine touched upon this when saying that, well, actually, the fact when residential assets became non-profitable in France is also because there have been some tenant mobilization that contributed to relocking this asset. Yeah, it's not a question, I'm sorry. But yeah.
Thank you for those points. They really resonate with me. And I'll just say like one really quick thing so we can eat, which is that I think there is just a lot of room for the kind of research we all do in things like this amorphous category of sustainability. Like everyone wants sustainable finance. We are the ones who know what actually happens in the name of sustainable finance. And I'm kind of inspired by a colleague of mine named Patrick Bigger, whom some of you may know, who left academia and started his own kind of green finance think tank, which I'm not saying we should all leave academia. But I think it's a good example of, if we want to have political goals, how we can't really be purists about this. Like you said, we can't just sit around criticizing all of it, and there are ways to participate in like pretty, I think, liberally or leftist, like progressive ways that if you generate like some pretty fine-grained how-tos on how to do sustainable finance, like people are paying attention to him. So thank you all for your really interesting comments, and I hope you have a good lunch.